The morning sun peeked over the horizon, painting the royal palace in shades of gold and amber. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the distant hum of excited chatter. Tourists from all corners of the globe bustled around, cameras slung around their necks, eager to capture a glimpse of one of the most iconic ceremonies, the changing of the guard. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing toward the towering gates where guards stood like statues, their crimson uniforms glowing under the sunlight. Among the crowd stood Henry, an elderly man whose presence seemed both ordinary and extraordinary. His weathered hands gripped the railing gently as he leaned forward slightly, his posture still holding traces of military discipline despite his age. A faded cap rested on his head, shielding his eyes from the glare of the rising sun. Beneath, his worn jacket tucked carefully into an inner pocket, lay a folded photograph. It was creased and yellowed with time, but to Henry it was priceless. A relic from another era, a reminder of friendships forged and battles fought. Henry wasn't here just to watch the ceremony. He had come seeking something deeper. For years, he had carried memories that refused to fade. Faces of comrades who would never grow old, moments frozen in time, and promises made beneath starlit skies far away from home. Today, standing amidst strangers, he felt a strange mix of belonging and isolation. He watched as families laughed and children ran about, oblivious to the weight of history surrounding them. Yet, there was a quiet beauty in the scene, a sense of continuity that comforted him. As the clock struck 10, the atmosphere shifted. The band began to play, its melody ringing out clear and proud. The rhythmic clatter of boots against stone echoed through the courtyard, drawing gasps of admiration from the onlookers. Henry's gaze followed the guards as they marched in perfect unison, their movements precise and practiced. Each step they took resonated with purpose, a testament to years of training and dedication. But for Henry, these men weren't merely performers putting on a show. They were guardians of tradition, protectors of a legacy much larger than themselves. He couldn't help but compare their polished brass buttons and gleaming rifles to the muddy trenches and battered helmets of his own youth. Back then, saluting wasn't just a formality. It was a sacred act, a way of acknowledging shared sacrifice and unwavering loyalty. As the ceremony unfolded before him, Henry's thoughts drifted back to those days when he too wore a uniform, when every salute carried the weight of lives lost and battles won. The crowd pressed closer, jostling for better views, but Henry remained, rooted to the spot. His heart swelled with emotion as he observed the solemn expressions of the guards. They reminded him of himself at their age, young, full of ideals, and ready to give everything for their country. And though decades separated him from those days, the fire of patriotism still burned within him, flickering softly like the embers of a dying campfire. Unbeknownst to him, this seemingly ordinary day was about to take an extraordinary turn, one that would leave everyone present speechless and deeply moved. As the ceremony continued, Henry found himself lost in a sea of memories. The music from the band faded into the background, replaced by the distant echoes of war, the thunderous roar of artillery, the sharp crackle of gunfire, and the haunting silence that followed. His mind wandered back to the faces of men he once called brothers, their laughter ringing in his ears even now. There was Tom, always quick with a joke to lighten the mood. Ramirez, who could fix anything with just a Swiss Army knife and determination. And Captain Lewis, whose steady voice had guided them through the darkest nights. Henry's fingers instinctively tightened around the photograph tucked inside his jacket. He didn't need to pull it out to see the image etched in his memory. A group of young soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, grinning despite the dirt smeared across their faces. They looked so full of life, so sure that they'd return home unscathed. But not all of them did. Some fell on foreign soil, their dreams buried alongside them. Others came back changed, carrying wounds no one could see. And then there was Henry, who survived but never truly left the battlefield behind. The weight of those memories pressed heavily on his chest. He glanced at the guards again, their disciplined movements a stark contrast to the chaos of combat he remembered. These men stood tall and composed, their expressions unreadable behind stoic masks. Yet Henry knew better. Beneath the polished uniforms and rigid protocol lay human hearts, just like his own. He wondered if they understood what it meant to serve not as part of a ceremonial tradition but as soldiers facing real danger. Did they know the fear of hearing shells whistle overhead or the ache of missing loved ones thousands of miles away? A pang of sadness washed over him as he thought about how much the world had changed since his days in uniform. Back then, letters were the lifeline connecting soldiers to their families, each word penned carefully on thin paper stained with sweat and tears. Now, technology bridged distances instantly, making communication effortless, but perhaps less meaningful. Still, some things remained constant: the pride of wearing a uniform, the bond between comrades, and the silent understanding among veterans that only those who've served can fully comprehend. Henry's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on his own journey after the war. Life hadn't been easy. Adjusting to civilian life felt like trying to fit pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite match. The cheers of victory faded quickly, replaced by the quiet struggles of finding purpose beyond the battlefield. Friends drifted apart. Jobs came and went, and the years slipped through his fingers like sand. Yet through it all, he held on to one truth: the sacrifices made were not in vain. Every hardship endured, every loss suffered, contributed to something greater than himself. As these reflections swirled in his mind, Henry straightened his posture. Despite the passage of time, he still carried the values instilled in him during his service: honor, duty, and respect. Today, surrounded by strangers watching a ceremonial display, he felt compelled to honor not just the guards before him, but everyone who had ever worn a uniform. His hand trembled slightly as he raised it in a crisp salute, the gesture automatic yet deeply heartfelt. It wasn't just for show. It was an acknowledgement of shared sacrifice, a nod to the invisible thread that connected generations of soldiers. For a moment, everything else faded away. The chatter of the crowd, the clinking of metals against uniforms, the rhythmic steps of marching feet. All that remained was Henry, standing alone yet profoundly connected to something larger than himself. What he didn't realize was that this simple act of reverence would soon ripple outward, touching lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. Corporal James Whitaker stood tall and motionless, his rifle resting precisely against his shoulder as he maintained the rigid stance expected of a royal guard. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, scanning the crowd without truly seeing them, just as he'd been trained to do. Yet something about the elderly man at the edge of the gathering caught his attention. At first it was subtle, a flicker of movement, a shift in posture that seemed out of place among the bustling tourists snapping photos and chatting excitedly. Then James noticed it, the unmistakable gesture of a salute. The sight of the old man raising his hand struck a chord deep within James. It wasn't the casual wave or polite nod often given by spectators. This was a proper military salute, crisp and deliberate, filled with meaning. As James stole another glance, his gaze lingered on the faded patch visible beneath the man's jacket, a detail most people wouldn't have noticed, but James recognized it immediately. It was the insignia of a soldier who had served in conflicts long past, a badge of honor earned through sacrifice and courage. James felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't see the man's face clearly from where he stood, but there was something profoundly moving about the way he held himself, proud yet burdened, steady yet fragile. The weight of years seemed etched into every line of his body, and James wondered what stories lay behind those eyes. Was he remembering battles fought decades ago? Friends lost? Sacrifices made? Whatever it was, the emotion radiating from the man was palpable, cutting through the formalities of the ceremony like a knife. For a brief moment, James hesitated. Protocol dictated that he remain still, unyielding, a symbol of discipline and tradition. But as he watched the old man hold his salute, unwavering despite the tremor in his hand, James felt an internal struggle begin to brew. This wasn't just any spectator offering a polite gesture. It was a veteran paying tribute not only to the guards before him but to all who had worn a uniform. How could he ignore such a profound act of respect? His mind raced with conflicting thoughts. On one side was duty, drilled into him over years of training, to stand firm, to follow orders without question. On the other was instinct, urging him to acknowledge the man's gesture, to bridge the gap between generations of service. James glanced at his fellow guards, their faces masks of stoicism, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside him. They continued, their routine, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding at the edge of the crowd. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as James wrestled with his decision. The band played on, the rhythmic beat of drums blending with the distant murmur of voices. Tourists shuffled closer, angling for better views, completely unaware of the emotional undercurrents swirling around them. James knew he had only seconds to decide. Should he adhere strictly to protocol, preserving the sanctity of the ceremony? Or should he step outside the lines, risking reprimand to honor the spirit of camaraderie that transcended rules? As the final notes of the anthem hung in the air, James made his choice. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the weight of what he was about to do. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his rifle ever so slightly, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to James it felt monumental, like crossing an invisible boundary between duty and humanity. He shifted his focus back to the elderly man, locking eyes with him across the crowded courtyard. In that fleeting connection, James saw gratitude, pride, and perhaps even a hint of surprise. What happened next would leave an indelible mark not just on James and the old man, but on everyone present, forever changing how they viewed the bond shared by those who serve. The moment Corporal James Whitaker stepped forward, the world seemed to hold its breath. His movement was subtle at first, a slight shift of his weight, a careful adjustment of his stance, but it was enough to draw murmurs from the crowd. Heads turned, cameras paused mid-click, and even the other guards exchanged fleeting glances, though they remained otherwise motionless. Breaking protocol wasn't something taken lightly, especially in front of hundreds of onlookers. But James didn't falter. His decision had been made, and now there was no turning back. With precision that spoke of years of training, James lowered his rifle completely, holding it firmly against his side as he took 2 deliberate steps toward the elderly man. The rhythmic clatter of his boots against the stone pavement echoed through the courtyard, cutting through the hum of conversation like a bell tolling in silence. Every step felt monumental, each one carrying the weight of tradition, respect, and humanity. For James, this wasn't just about acknowledging a veteran. It was about honoring the sacrifices made by those who came before him, the very foundation upon which his own service stood. Henry, the elderly man, froze for a split second when he realized what was happening. His hand, still raised in salute, began to tremble slightly, not from weakness but from emotion. He hadn't expected this. No one had. Yet here was a young guard, stepping out of formation, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. In that instant, Henry saw more than just a soldier following orders. He saw a human being reaching across time and experience to connect with someone who understood the language of sacrifice. As James approached, he brought his right hand up, in a sharp, flawless salute. It was a mirror image of Henry's gesture, yet imbued with its own unique meaning. Where Henry's salute carried the weight of memory and gratitude, James's radiated respect and humility. Their eyes met over the distance between them, locking in a gaze that transcended words. Neither man needed to speak. Their shared understanding passed silently between them, a bond forged in the unspoken language of service. The crowd, initially hushed, erupted into whispers. Some people gasped audibly, while others pressed closer, craning their necks to catch every detail of the unfolding scene. Parents knelt beside their children, explaining the significance of what they were witnessing. "That's a soldier saluting another soldier," one mother said softly, her voice thick with emotion. A teenager filming the ceremony stopped recording altogether, lowering his phone to simply watch, captivated by the raw authenticity of the moment. James didn't linger long. After holding his salute for several seconds, he carefully returned to his original position within the ranks. But the impact of his actions rippled outward, touching everyone present. Even the other guards, bound by strict discipline, couldn't hide the flicker of admiration in their expressions. They may not have moved, but their rigid postures seemed to soften ever so slightly, as if acknowledging the gravity of what had just occurred. For Henry, the moment was overwhelming. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision as he slowly lowered his hand. He had come to the palace seeking a connection to the past, a reminder of the values he once fought for. What he received instead was far greater: recognition, respect, and a tangible link to the future. As he watched James return to his place, Henry felt a warmth spread through his chest, a reassurance that the sacrifices of his generation had not been forgotten, that their legacy lived on in the hearts of those who continued to serve. Though the ceremony resumed as planned, nothing felt quite the same afterward. The air buzzed with energy, charged by the unexpected display of mutual respect. Strangers exchanged smiles, nodding knowingly as if sharing a secret only they could understand. And somewhere in the background, a child tugged at her father's sleeve, asking, "Why did the guard do that?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered yet profoundly meaningful, a testament to the power of simple, heartfelt gestures to inspire and unite. As the ceremony continued, the atmosphere remained charged with emotion, but James couldn't shake the feeling that this moment wasn't over. Not yet. His salute to Henry had been a powerful gesture, but something inside him urged him to go further, to bridge the gap between them in a way that words alone couldn't achieve. When the band struck up another tune and the guards began their measured march, James made his decision. Breaking rank entirely, he stepped forward once more, this time moving closer to where Henry stood. The crowd, still buzzing from the earlier exchange, fell silent again. All eyes were on James as he approached Henry with purposeful strides. For a brief moment, Henry looked startled, unsure of what was happening. But then James extended his hand, steady and firm, offering it in a gesture of camaraderie. Without hesitation, Henry reached out, his weathered fingers gripping James's hand tightly. The handshake was more than just a polite formality. It was a connection, a bond forged across generations of service. "Thank you, sir," James said softly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby, "for everything." The simplicity of the words belied their depth. They weren't just thanking Henry for his personal sacrifices. They were acknowledging the collective efforts of all veterans who had paved the way for soldiers like James. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from someone trained to suppress emotion, and it resonated deeply with everyone watching. Henry's throat tightened as he struggled to find his own words. "No," he finally managed, his voice hoarse but full of sincerity. "Thank you. You carry the torch now." His gaze softened as he looked at James, seeing not just a young guard but a guardian of the future, a living reminder that the values he and his comrades had fought for were still alive and cherished. Their interaction didn't last long, just a few exchanged sentences, but it left an indelible mark. James listened intently as Henry shared a snippet of his story, speaking of battles fought in distant lands and friendships lost along the way. There was no bitterness in his tone, only gratitude for having served alongside brave men and women. James nodded thoughtfully, absorbing every word. Though their experiences were vastly different, separated by decades of change and progress, they found common ground in their shared commitment to duty and honor. When their conversation ended, James did something unexpected. He unfastened a small pin from his uniform bearing the insignia of his regiment. It was a modest token, no larger than a coin, but it carried immense significance. Holding it out to Henry, James explained, "This is for you, sir. A small reminder that your legacy lives on in us." Henry accepted it with trembling hands, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He knew the weight of such a gift. It wasn't merely a trinket but a symbol of respect and continuity. The crowd erupted into applause again, louder this time, as if releasing pent-up emotions they hadn't realized they were holding. People clapped not just for James or Henry but for the ideals they represented: sacrifice, unity, and the enduring spirit of service. Strangers embraced one another, moved by the humanity of the moment. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders, pointing toward James and Henry as if to say, "Remember this. Remember what true respect looks like." As James returned to his position within the ranks, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a routine ceremony had transformed into something extraordinary, an opportunity to honor the past while inspiring the present. And for Henry, the encounter was nothing short of healing. The isolation he sometimes felt as a veteran melted away, replaced by a profound sense of belonging. As he turned to leave the courtyard, clutching the pin in his hand, he knew he would never forget this day. The day a young guard reminded him that his sacrifices mattered, and that the torch he had carried so long ago burned brightly still. The applause that erupted from the crowd was thunderous, a tidal wave of emotion that swept through the courtyard like wildfire. People clapped not out of politeness but with genuine admiration, their hands moving in unison as if guided by a shared heartbeat. Some wiped tears from their eyes while others simply stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The scene unfolding before them wasn't scripted or rehearsed. It was raw, authentic, and deeply human, and it resonated on a level that transcended age, nationality, or background. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer, using the moment as an impromptu lesson in gratitude and respect. One father knelt beside his young son, pointing toward James and Henry. "See those two men?" he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "One is old and one is young, but both are heroes. They remind us how important it is to honor those who protect our freedom." The boy nodded solemnly, clutching his father's hand tightly, perhaps too young to fully understand but old enough to feel the weight of the moment. Cameras flashed endlessly, capturing every angle of the exchange between James and Henry. Phones were held high, recording videos that would soon flood social media platforms, spreading the story far beyond the palace walls. A teenager nearby paused her live stream long enough to whisper, "This is... wow. I've never seen anything like this." Her words echoed the sentiment of many. This was more than just a ceremony. It was a lesson in humanity, a reminder of the invisible threads that bind people together across time and experience. Strangers began to talk to each other, sharing stories and reflections sparked by the unexpected display of mutual respect. An elderly woman standing near the front turned to a man beside her and said, "I lost my husband in the war. He was a soldier, like that gentleman over there." She gestured toward Henry, her voice trembling slightly. "Seeing this today, it's like he's being honored too. Thank you for letting me share that." The man nodded, offering a kind smile, and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Moments like these rippled through the crowd, turning individual spectators into a collective community bound by empathy and shared emotion. Even the guards, though trained to remain stoic, couldn't help but be affected. Their rigid postures softened ever so slightly, betraying the flicker of pride in their eyes. They may not have broken rank like James, but they felt the significance of his actions, a testament to the enduring values they all swore to uphold. One guard glanced at James briefly, his expression unreadable beneath his bearskin hat, but the subtle nod he gave spoke volumes. It was a silent acknowledgement that James had done something extraordinary, something that reminded everyone why they wore the uniform in the first place. As the ceremony drew to a close, the energy in the courtyard remained electric. People lingered, reluctant to leave, as if afraid the magic of the moment might fade once they stepped away. Some approached Henry, shaking his hand and thanking him for his service. Others sought out James, expressing their admiration for his courage in stepping outside protocol to honor a veteran. Both men became unwitting ambassadors of a message larger than themselves, that respect knows no boundaries, whether of time, rank, or circumstance. For Henry, the attention was humbling. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but he accepted. the gratitude graciously, nodding and smiling despite the lump in his throat. Each handshake, each word of thanks, felt like a balm to wounds he hadn't realized were still tender. For James, the reactions were equally overwhelming. Though he had acted on instinct, he now understood the ripple effect of his decision. Strangers hugged him, patted his back, and told him he had restored their faith in humanity. By the time the crowd began to disperse, the mood had shifted entirely. What had started as a routine morning at the palace had transformed into something unforgettable, a celebration of service, sacrifice, and connection. As Henry walked away, clutching the pin James had given him, and as James returned to his duties, both men carried with them the knowledge that they had touched lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The cheers of the crowd followed them, fading slowly into the distance, but the impact of their actions would linger long after the day ended. After the ceremony, James escorted Henry to a quieter corner of the palace grounds, away from the lingering crowd and the hum of excited chatter. The two men walked side by side, their steps slow and deliberate, as if neither wanted the moment to end too soon. Though decades separated them in age and experience, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond that transcended time and circumstance. They found a bench beneath the shade of an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching, skyward like arms reaching for the past. Seated together, they began to talk, sharing stories that wove their lives into a single narrative of service and sacrifice. Henry spoke first, his voice steady but tinged with nostalgia. He recounted tales of his days in the military, the camaraderie of his unit, the challenges of training, and the harrowing moments on the battlefield. "You learn quickly what matters when you're out there," he said, his gaze distant as if reliving those memories. "It's not about medals or glory. It's about the person next to you. You fight for them as much as for your country." James listened intently, nodding as he absorbed every word. When it was his turn to speak, he shared his own journey, explaining how he had joined the military inspired by stories of bravery passed down through generations. "I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself," he admitted, his tone humble yet resolute. "But I'll admit my battles are different from yours. I've never faced combat like you did. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done what you and your comrades did." Henry chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Don't sell yourself short, son. Courage isn't just about facing bullets. It's about standing firm when it's hard, even when no one's watching. Like what you did today. That took guts." His words hung in the air, simple but profound, reminding James that acts of valor come in many forms. As they continued talking, they discovered unexpected parallels in their experiences. Both spoke of the loneliness that sometimes accompanies service, the longing for home, the weight of responsibility, and the struggle to adjust to life after duty. Yet both also expressed a deep love for their roles as protectors, guardians of something greater than themselves. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by moments of laughter and reflection, bridging the gap between the trenches of war and the polished halls of the palace. Before parting ways, James reached into his pocket and retrieved a small pin bearing the insignia of his regiment. "This is for you, sir," he said, pressing it gently into Henry's palm. "A reminder that your legacy lives on in us. We carry your torch, even if we do it differently now." Henry accepted the gift with trembling hands, his eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This means more than you know." Their handshake this time was firmer, more confident, as if sealing a pact across generations. As they stood to leave, James saluted Henry one final time, holding the gesture longer than protocol required. Henry returned it with equal reverence, his posture straight despite his age. It was a silent promise. Though their paths were different, their purpose remained the same. When they finally parted, Henry walked away with a renewed sense of pride, clutching the pin tightly in his hand. James returned to his duties, his heart lighter and his resolve stronger. Neither man realized it then, but their brief encounter would leave a lasting impact, not just on themselves, but on everyone who heard their story. It was proof that Connections forged in moments of authenticity can transcend barriers, inspiring others to honor the past while building a better future. The story of James and Henry spread like wildfire, carried by the voices of those who had witnessed their unforgettable encounter. Within hours, videos and photos flooded social media platforms, accompanied by captions that captured the emotional weight of the moment. A young guard honors a veteran and brings everyone to tears, one post read, quickly amassing thousands of likes and shares. News outlets picked up the story, interviewing spectators who described the scene in vivid detail. "It wasn't just about breaking protocol," one woman said during an interview. "It was about humanity. It reminded us all what true respect looks like." Veterans organizations praised James for his gesture, calling it a testament to the enduring bond between soldiers of different eras. Letters poured into the palace from veterans across the country, many expressing gratitude for the recognition shown to Henry. Some shared their own stories of service, while others simply thanked James for reminding them that their sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. The pin James had given Henry became a symbol of this connection, a tangible reminder that the torch of duty and honor is passed down through generations. Henry, once content to live quietly in the shadows of his memories, found himself thrust into the spotlight. Invitations arrived from all corners. Schools asked him to speak at assemblies, community groups requested his presence at events, and even local museums sought to preserve his story as part of their exhibits. At first he hesitated, unsure if he wanted to relive the past so publicly. But as he stood before audiences, sharing tales of camaraderie, sacrifice, and resilience, he realized how much his words meant to others. Young people approached him, after speeches, thanking him for inspiring them to serve their communities in whatever way they could. For Henry, it was a chance not only to share his experiences but also to ensure that the lessons of the past weren't lost on future generations. For James, the aftermath of that day brought its own challenges and rewards. His superiors, initially, questioned his decision to break protocol, but public support for his actions quickly turned the tide. Far from facing reprimand, James was celebrated as a model of compassion and leadership. He received commendations from high-ranking officials and heartfelt notes from strangers around the world. Yet, more importantly, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every time he donned his uniform, he remembered Henry's weathered face and the pride in his eyes when they shook hands. It reinforced why he had chosen this path, to honor those who came before him and protect the values they fought for. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of their meeting continued to unfold. Inspired by the story, volunteers organized events to connect veterans with active duty personnel, fostering dialogue and understanding between the two groups. Schools incorporated the incident into lesson plans, teaching students about the importance of gratitude and respect. Even families began having deeper conversations about service and sacrifice, sparked by the simple yet profound act of a young guard saluting an old soldier. For both James and Henry, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but neither forgot the impact of that extraordinary day. They stayed in touch, exchanging letters and occasionally meeting for coffee. Their friendship became a living example of how connections can transcend age, experience, and circumstance. When asked about it, James often said, "I didn't do anything special, I just followed my heart." And Henry would smile, adding, "Sometimes, following your heart is the most special thing you can do." Years later, when people spoke of that morning at the palace, they didn't focus on the ceremony itself or the grandeur of the setting. Instead, they remembered the moment when two men, one young, one old, reached across time to acknowledge each other's humanity. It was a reminder that true patriotism isn't about flags or anthems. It's about recognizing and respecting the sacrifices made by those who came before us. In honoring the past, we shape the future, and in doing so, we keep the flame of courage and compassion alive for generations to come.